We're back on chapter 8. This is the second video for chapter 8. So if you haven't watched the first video for chapter 8 in the text, then go ahead and you might want to watch that first. Chapter 8 is called Performing Advanced Editing Techniques in the Adobe Premiere Pro CC Class You in a Book 2017 release. But as I said in a previous episode, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, they're pretty much all the same. Last time we executed a traditional 3-point edit. I walked you through all the steps for that as a kind of review. Now what we're going to do is we're going to see what happens if we do one of these non-traditional or less common 3-point edits. We're still doing 3-point edits. As you can see, I have an out point, my source monitor, and an in point and an out point in my timeline. So basically what's going to happen when I hit the overwrite key is, and I'll hit the overwrite key and you can actually, let's do this. Let's watch the video. Let's watch the video and then let's do the edit and let's see if we can work out exactly what Premiere did. So we're going to watch it from the beginning of the media, the beginning of the clip, or what we call media start, because there's no end point in this clip. We're going to watch it to the out point. Ladies and gentlemen, racer. Okay, so we watch it to the out point. That's all we're going to see. It's 13 seconds and 12 frames long of a 18-second and 29-frame clip. That was a total duration. Okay, and then you can see I have an in point and an out point in my timeline. Okay, now you know that the white numbers in my source monitor tell me how much of the clip I have marked. In this case, I don't have an in point, but that's okay. It's going to tell me how much of the clip is marked in order to edit to the timeline from media start to the out point, from media start to the out point. And as you can see, it's 13 seconds and 12 frames of the footage from media start to the out point. So I want to fit that 13 seconds and 12 frames into my timeline down here. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Okay, let me make it a lot bigger. Okay, that's good. Okay, so in my timeline, I have an in point and an out point. And if you look at how much time is between my in point and out point, I can look in the lower right-hand corner of my program monitor and I get a duration of 17 seconds and 16 frames. 17 seconds and 16 frames, that's how long, that's the size of this in point and out point. There's no footage there, of course, as you can see, but it's preparing this 17-second and 16 frame space here for this clip. Now, the first thing you're going to say is, wait a second, if I have a 13-second and 12 frame clip, but a 17-second and 16 frame space waiting for that clip, something doesn't match. These durations don't match. 13 seconds and 12 frames doesn't neatly fit into 17 seconds and 16 frames. So what's going to happen with that extra 4 seconds and 4 frames? Okay, well, it depends on where the endpoint is. First of all, you're not going to lose any of your footage because the source clip is smaller than the period of time you have marked in your timeline. But how this is going to arrange the clip in the timeline is this. It's going to look at the mark that you do have. You have an out point here, okay? It's going to take this out point and it's going to match the out point in the source clip with the out point in the timeline, okay? And then what it's going to do is it's going to start editing footage down to the timeline, and it's going to basically, we call it, well, I'll give you the name after I finish, after you do it, but it's going to back read it. It's going to read it back. It's not going to play it backwards like this. It's not going to play it backwards in the finished version, but it's going to match up the two edit points and it's going to start filling up this space in the timeline, okay, between my in and my out point, using the out points as the primary kind of anchor or the designator that tells you where this has to land. And it's going to read the footage from the source clip going from back to front or from out to in. And it's going to take as much of it as it can or as much of it as it needs. In this case, I'm still going to have a gap because I have more footage, more space in my timeline than I have footage marked. So let's go ahead and do an override insert and see what happens. Once again, I want to point out I have my source track indicators patched to my timeline headers, okay? And so my video is going to appear in the V1 track and my audio is going to appear in the A1 track. When I hit my period for my keyboard shortcut for override edit, okay? Okay, it's going to say two things. It's going to say one thing here. It's going to give me a fit clip window, okay? And this fit clip basically says that, hey, the source clip is shorter than the destination. Like I said, 13 seconds and 12 frames is 4 seconds and 2 frames shorter than 17 seconds and 16 frames. Hey, how am I supposed to reconcile this? Okay, now what I can do is I can change the clip speed, fit the fill, okay? We're gonna talk about that later. I could ignore the source out point. So that means that I could ignore the out point, my timeline, and just go ahead and start editing it from the beginning of the media clip to the end of the out point in the source monitor. Okay. I'm sorry. With ignore source out point, I apologize. Ignoring the source out point means that it's going to just start reading footage from beginning of the source clip, and it's going to fill up from the in point to the out point in the timeline. It's going to just start from the beginning of the media start, and it's going to just keep reading footage from left to right until it fills up this 17 seconds and 16 frames of space. Okay, that's option one. The second option is I could ignore the sequence endpoint. We all know sequence is another word for timeline. So this is my sequence endpoint. It could ignore my sequence endpoint and set, like I said before, my out point from my source monitor to my out point in my timeline and start reading backwards from out point towards the media start to fill up this, to fill up my timeline ending at the out point. So it's going to end at the out point. It's going to read it backwards. They call that back timing. Back timing. Back timing has a few different uses in media, but this is the way the editors use it. It's going to back time it. So it means it's going to match my out points, and then it's going to fill up this space as much as it can, okay, from end going to beginning, okay? That's what would happen if I were to ignore my sequence endpoint. So this endpoint right here, it would go away. Pretend like it didn't exist. I would have just really a 2-point edit, an out point in my source monitor and an out point in my timeline. And finally, ignore sequence out point. What it would do is it would ignore this out point right here in my sequence, and it would start reading footage from front to back or beginning to end from media start all the way until the out point, my source monitor. You would use that footage, all of this footage, and start to fill up from the end point, my timeline, all the way until I got to the out point in my source monitor. Okay, so the one we're going to try first, let's try ignore sequence endpoint. Okay, because that's kind of the tree I was barking up. And we're going to hit OK. So as you can see, let's look at what it gave me in my timeline. Okay. So it gave me that 13 seconds and 12 frames. Okay. But notice that at the beginning of the timeline, I have a big gap. This gap should be about, what, 4 seconds and 2 frames, I think I said. Okay, let's play it and see. There's the gap. And then the clip starts. Okay, let's see if that's 4 seconds and 2 frames. I'm gonna set an in point at the beginning of the timeline and an out point right at the very first, right before the very first frame of a clip in the timeline. It's actually 4 seconds and 6 frames. So I was actually 4 frames off, I believe, in what I said. But that was just me in bad math. But you get the idea here where essentially, I'm gonna go back to undo a couple of times, okay? When I overwrite edited this 13 seconds and 12 frame clip into the timeline, ignoring the in point in the timeline. It's going to match my out point in the source monitor with the out point in the timeline, and then back time the footage. That means start to fill up this space going from the end of this source clip reading towards the head of the clip or towards media start. It's going to fill it up in the timeline. It's not going to play it backwards when I play it back in the timeline. It'll be regular playing it forward. It's just how is it placing it in the timeline? Okay. Now, because of the fact that 13 seconds and 12 frames is not big enough to fill the gap from the out point to the very beginning of the timeline, that's why I had that 4 seconds and however many frames it was gap, black gap at the beginning, because it wasn't enough to fit in. Imagine this is like a parking space meant for a limousine, okay? But this is a Volkswagen Bug, very small car, all right? So it's going to park my Volkswagen Bug into the parking space. It's going to back in. It's going to end at the very end of the parking space on the side of the street. Say it's a downtown kind of parking space. You can see that the Volkswagen Bug is not going to be, let me do it again. It's not going to be the Volkswagen Bug, which is now my clip in my timeline, is not long enough to fill in this entire parking space, if you want to think of it like that. Okay? So you can kind of think of whatever's in the source monitor, you can think of that as a car, and whatever you have marked in the timeline, you could think of that as a parking space. And the size of the car and the size of the parking space, they can be exactly the same. Okay, well, not necessarily exactly the same because of the fact that it had to be like a 4-point edit where the exact same durations in your source monitor are marked in your timeline, and that's pretty rare. Or your source clip can be shorter than the area you have marked in the timeline, or your car can be smaller in size than the parking space. That's what we just did, and it's going to back in, right? So that means that it's going to end where the parking space ends, of course. Or I can have it so that my source clip is longer than the area that I marked in my timeline, in which case that means that part of this source clip is not going to make it down to the timeline. For example, if I have 17 seconds and 16 frames marked, but this clip was a 20-second clip, okay, what's going to happen is, let's see what happens. Let's try it now. Okay, I have an 18-second and 28 frame portion marked, but I only have a 17-second and 16 frame portion here. This is a 4-point edit. We're not into that yet, although this is kind of the same thing. I'm going to get rid of my endpoint in my timeline. Okay, got rid of Option I in my timeline. I got rid of my endpoint in my timeline. Let's try an overwrite edit now. Okay, and so what it did is that it went ahead and it put the clip in. You can say, well, it fit nicely, didn't it? Well, no, not really, because what it did is that it matched up my out point in my source monitor to the out point in my timeline. Because I have no endpoint in my source monitor, I have no endpoint in my timeline and no endpoint in my source monitor, it just back timed it starting from the end and read it from right to left until it just ran out of space and hit the head of the timeline at 0,000,000. And to prove that to you, well, you can take a look at what we have here. Let's look at the whole clip. Look at where it starts, the boat starts in the source monitor. Look at where it ends, and we'll compare that to where it starts and ends in the, the timeline.
Gentlemen, race 13, closest to Adobe. Lane 1 is the Honey Badgers. Lane 2.
Okay, so let's do our edit to the timeline here. Okay, now let's see. You should already see a difference. The difference is we didn't get all the clip at its head. There's some footage missing from the very front of this clip.
13, closest to Adobe. Lane 1 is the Honey Badgers.
So as you can see, we got 17 seconds and 16 frames of clip in my timeline here. Okay, I'll end on the last clip, 17:15. But I had 18 seconds and 28 frames marked in my source monitor. Okay, so that means, well, okay, it ended in the right place. You see here? It ended in the right place. It was just that we didn't get the very beginning. That's the very beginning of the source clip. That's the very beginning of what came down to the timeline. And you can see from these two clips that they're not in the same place. Okay? Look at your source monitor. Look at the detail in the far right corner. You have another boat and you have some people on a dock there. Okay? Look at what's in the timeline. No boat, no people on the dock. So what that basically tells me is that I have the end of it, but when I go to the beginning of it, it had to cut off the head of the clip or the beginning of the clip in order to, fit the clip in the timeline with the space that was available. Okay. So I'm going to end it there for this one. This was a non-traditional 3-point edit where we had an out point in our source monitor and an out point in my timeline, but the same thing would have happened if I would have done an edit where I had an in point and out point in my source monitor. I'm sorry, an in point and out point in my timeline and an out point in my source monitor. It would have had a similar effect. Okay, so that's it for that. Stay tuned for episode 3.